So we are now live on YouTube. It must have been me going on about it. So good evening, everybody who's joined us this evening. We are really proud to welcome you all to another British Film Designers Guild webinar. And this evening we are going to be doing one on Chernobyl. And the people you see in front of me are all award-winning members of the team that created that fantastic TV show. I just want to say a little bit about the British Film Designers Guild first. We wouldn't be here tonight without the British Film Designers Guild. It was formed 70 years ago, and the intentions of the Guild were to raise the profile of the art department and to promote excellence in the art department itself. And we are very lucky that we have a lot of wonderful members. We have over 530. And the core principles of the Guild that were started still are what we use today, and we hope to continue it for the future years to come. What we're going to do is we're just going to show you now a very short clip from Chernobyl just to refresh your memories of that wonderful series. Over to you, Ali. Pregnant pause.
All of the good we did, it doesn't matter. What does matter is that to them, justice was done. See, a just world is a sane world. There was nothing sane about Chernobyl.
I'm pleased to report that the situation in Chernobyl is stable. In terms of radiation, I'm told it's the equivalent of a chest X-ray.
No, Chernobyl is on fire. And every atom of uranium is like a bullet, penetrating everything in its path. Metal, concrete, flesh. Now, Chernobyl holds over 3 trillion of these bullets. Some of them will not stop firing for 50,000 years.
Tell me how to put it out.
You are dealing with something that has never occurred on this planet before.
Cut the phone lines. Contain the spread of misinformation.
What will happen to our boys?
The pain is unimaginable. In 3 days to 3 weeks, you're dead.
You can see him, but you cannot touch him. Do you understand?
What happened on the night of the accident?
Asking the right question will get you the truth. There is no truth.
What happened then? What happened after? All of it. All of it. Madness.
Exciting stuff. I'm hoping this is going to be a very exciting webinar. I'd just like to say congratulations to all the people that are on the screen right now for your craft or BAFTA nomination that you got today. I think it was announced today. And I'd also like to say congratulations to all the other people from the British Film Designers Guild who we are so can't believe it that every other nomination in the art department contains a guild member. So well done everybody who is part of that. Chernobyl was a nuclear disaster, just to remind people who are watching if they didn't know what it was, or maybe they haven't, hopefully they've watched the series. And it happened in 1986, and it was probably one of the worst disasters that the world has ever seen. And it was then there have been other programs over the years that have been done about it in films, but this series is one of the most successful. Hence, we've got these great people in front of us. I'm just going to introduce you to them. So we have Jakob Eater, who was the director of photography. And he, I'm just going to find he attended the National Film School in Beaconsfield. He's shot 15 feature films and many documentaries and commercials. He's received multiple national and international awards for his features, many of them for his work with the director Joachim Trier. He worked with him on a film called Reprise and Thelma, to name a few. And his return to television was marked with Chernobyl, the successful television series, after 20 years, because he started in the late 90s with reconstructing and dramatizing local accidents and incidents for a Swedish TV show. That's very interesting, Jakob, when I read that. I found that fascinating. And in February of this year, Jakob received the BSc award for his work on Chernobyl. We also have in front of us, we have Luke Hull. Luke Hull's production designer on the show. He graduated from the National Film and Television School, and he then gained various experience in art departments, including Prometheus and King Arthur Legend of the Sword, before deciding to become a production designer. His credits include Fortitude Season 2, Howard's End, and of course, Chernobyl. We also have in front of us Lindsay Macfarlane. Hello, Lindsay, who was the visual effects supervisor. And Lindsay graduated from Kingston, with a first class honours degree. Well done, Lindsay.
Back in the day.
During the love of animation and filmmaking, he got his first break in the industry on HBO's Band of Brothers. For the last 15 years, he's been working as a visual effects producer and more recently, a visual effects supervisor. Along the way, Lindsay's worked internationally on many high-profile visual effects projects for directors such as Ridley Scott, George Clooney, Ron Howard, and studios Disney's, Warner's, Sony, Fox, and Apple. Titles include Harry Potter, the Narnia trilogy, Tomb Raider, The Da Vinci Code, and Inferno, and more recently, obviously, getting an Emmy for his work on this HBO series, Chernobyl. We also have in front of us Karen Wakefield. And Karen was the supervising art director on Chernobyl. She started as a theatre designer, and then she moved across into the film industry about 30 years ago, working in all areas of the art department, starting as an assistant to a set decorator, a stylist on commercials, and as an art director on a range of low budget to high-end movies, including Shallow Grave, Shaun of the Dead, The Duchess, Kingdom of Heaven, and Prometheus. And she also won an Emmy for Chernobyl. And lastly, we have the lovely Claire Levinson Gendler. And Claire was the set decorator on Chernobyl. And she has worked on a wide range of shows, including Top Boy, Vanity Fair, and Broadchurch. She is currently working on the Amazon show The Power. However, she did start her career in films in various roles, including scenic artist and prop maker, before settling into the role of set decorator, where she said the glass slipper fit perfectly. So good evening to all of you. I'm delighted that you could join us. And we've had quite a few questions that have come in from other people, but we've also assembled a list of questions ourselves. And so I was going to start off with you, Jakob, asking you a question about which you can all obviously join in and answer, but it's about Lithuania. You shot a lot of Chernobyl in Lithuania, and it's not known for having an established film industry. So I just wanted to, maybe if you could tell the people watching what that was like, what the structure was like working in a country like that.
Well, to start off with, I had a wonderful experience working with the local crew in Lithuania. For example, one of our sparks, Vitas, was in his late 50s, 59, 60. He started out working in the Soviet era of filmmaking, where they had 2 DOPs on set on one film. And then in the mid-90s, the Americans came and they shot this show called The New Adventures of Robin Hood in the mid-90s. And then there were those Scandinavians who came at the end of the 90s and 2000 and Germans. And so they've always been, like the country itself, they've been exposed to many different ways of dealing with foreigners. So they were very adaptable and extremely keen, and they can work the American way, they can work the Swedish way. I had a Swedish gaffer, so they kind of adapt themselves to the Swedish way. So I only have good things to say, really. It was just fantastic, and our
an interesting place. Yeah, an interesting place to choose to film in. So Luke, why was the decision made to go to Lithuania? I know there were a lot of locations that you had to find. Did that take you quite a long time finding all the locations? Was there a sort of conversation at the beginning about, should we go to Lithuania? Should we go somewhere else? Should we, what should we do?
There was a conversation, but it wasn't with me. So I think the only thing that was decided actually before I came aboard was the fact that we would be making it in Lithuania. So then that kind of was interesting. So I think the first thing I did on the first week of the job was to fly to Lithuania and do a scout for a week just to get an idea of what was there. One of the main reasons I think they, as a production, had settled on Lithuania was because it had just joined the European Union. It also had an RBMK reactor, which was very similar, certainly in scale, as a nuclear reactor to Chernobyl. So the idea was always that we would use it somehow, although that later came quite late. But yeah, I mean, perfectly honest, the thing that held us back with Lithuania a little bit was just immediately there was a lack of scale in a story that needed so much scale and scope. So we just broadened out a bit, and we had a look at other countries, Latvia and Estonia, and also in Kiev, and we kind of settled on Kiev because it gave us our sort of Moscow streets and some sort of more Soviet interiors that have been stuck in that bubble. A lot of modernization had happened in Lithuania, but in terms of it was a good choice.
You shot in 3 countries. You shot in Lithuania, the Ukraine, I believe, and Russia. So I just wondered, for all of you and Luke, what was that like? You'd have to have different crews. You also, Luke, doing the budgeting when you were doing the budget at the very beginning. How did that? I think people are often interested who watch these things to see about, because lots of people say, oh, it's really cheap in that country. Oh, they have everything you need. And a lot of us know when we travel to those distant countries, and I know that Karen can say about this, that often they don't have the facilities that you need for the art department, and to build big sets you often have to bring things in from other countries. Did you find that, and did you find you had to reflect anything like that in the budget?
Yeah, I mean, it was really interesting at the beginning because this was probably one of the first jobs where the budget had to increase quite dramatically after we started it. So they'd done a feasibility study quite early on, which set the bar a little lower, I'd say, and maybe the scale the project ended up was slightly larger than what Lithuania was expecting. And Karen, I mean, to be honest, one of the first things we did, Karen started really early, and we had to re-budget the whole thing because the ambition was clearly on the page. And we wanted to achieve that. I mean, and that, I think for me, that then changed again 6 weeks later when we actually moved to Lithuania and realized sort of an added layer of importance on telling the story because we felt that way. I mean, I'm sure, Karen can explain as well, but it was complex to budget because some things are cheaper for sure, but then other things were more expensive. Some things weren't available. Some things we needed at speed, as you do in the industry, and we had to have them made back here in Germany and brought over. So
and Karen, did you when you were doing those decisions, there were obviously different elements to the set builds, and bigger bits and smaller bits. So your involvement with Lindsay and with the other departments as well, I mean, that would have been quite a complicated thing, would it not, to have, and with camera and everything, and 3 countries and language barriers, etc.
Well, I mean, I've worked abroad a lot. I've worked in 13 countries, so I have quite a good concept not only of budgets and how much costs of construction and props and everything it is in other countries. Also, I always look out for. I went there quite earlier on. We went on a few trips. I had to interview the whole crew because nearly all the crew for us were Lithuanians. Although total we were a bit like United Nations. We had a lot of people from a lot of different countries. It was quite nice actually. But yes, I'm used to talking to and getting information from people and knowing straight from the off what there is there and what is available. So regarding budget, I do know where to sort of put sections of money regarding departments, and then again it's just my job to make sure everybody knows what the art department's doing. So regarding visual effects, we had 3 construction managers. I couldn't get to Kiev. I didn't go to the Kiev in the end because there was so much going on. It was quite late in the day when we actually got all locations from Kiev. So it wasn't I couldn't actually go there, so all that was done via the internet regarding to the art directors there, and then Luke would go over and just check what they were doing and what they're up to, because in total there was 17 locations in Ukraine, but we had 44 locations in Lithuania, of which we did struggle quite a bit trying to find enough Soviet looking locations in Lithuania, because there's not much Soviet information left there at all regarding buildings, regarding props, regarding, because it really isn't wanted anymore. And we were told it's not really legal to hold on to Soviet items. So a lot of the buildings have gone and people just don't want to be reminded of it. And then we had 91 sets in total. We had and 28 builds in Lithuania. So Luke did the traveling with.
It's quite a lot. Yeah, it's a lot of work. So just going back slightly, because I think people would be interested that the Chernobyl disaster obviously is very well documented. There was a lot of American groups went in and other countries went in to take photographs of the nuclear power station afterwards and all the surrounding towns. And I think there's a couple of books. I've got one that has photos of empty school buildings and all of those things. So Lindsay, obviously, you know, there must have been pressure for you. I know there's not a lot of nuclear disasters that you've necessarily seen yourself in real, but there must have been quite a lot of pressure to get the scale of it right, you know, with you and the art department, and also Jakob, you with the lighting, you know, all the sort of effects of when it was going off, and you know, the towers of smoke, and you know, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, there's obviously a lot of great reference, and at the time that I came onto the project, there was already a huge sort of library archive of reference which we could draw on. But I didn't really feel the pressure so much of recreating that. I think my sort of strongest memory of Chernobyl looking back is the first time I read the script. And at that point I was kind of just consulting. So I wasn't necessarily on board to do the whole thing. But I remember reading the first few pages of the script and it was very obvious. It's a, you know, incredible story, very important story, brilliant script about the people on the ground experiencing this disaster. And then I got to whatever page it was fairly early on, and it was like, obviously that's going to be a big visual effect shot. And it was almost like my heart slightly sunk, because that's what I felt, the pressure of not introducing any sense of artifice into the piece. You know, we cut to a obvious person against a blue screen or a CG creation, which is just going to pop you out of this incredible story. So it was, the pressure that I felt was just making everything that we did as invisible as possible, so you were still just in the drama of the piece. You weren't aware that we'd added whatever we'd added or done whatever we'd done. But yeah, I think that was the pressure for me. And obviously there's some great reference, but Luke will probably talk about this. It wasn't always, the mantra wasn't we have to be exactly authentic to everything. It was more about what works for the way we want to tell this story. Obviously the authenticity was important as well, but it wasn't solely a piece about recreating it exactly as per the reference.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I've certainly myself watched some films on, you know, Russian. I used to be quite obsessed about watching a lot of Russian films, and I was trying to remember. I made a note to myself. I looked at Tarkovsky's Ivan's Childhood, which I always found fascinating when I was younger. Jakob, you're nodding because you probably may have watched that. And I also, you know, Ballad of a Soldier. I couldn't remember. I wrote Klimov's Come and See, because, you know, those were ones that I remembered watching, you know, which were very strong. And the series had a very strong lighting design to it. And, you know, I mean, I know that this is a group discussion that you have at the beginning, but it affects all of the people here in front of me on the screen, and costume, obviously, and makeup. And, you know, so early on, you would have had these conversations. Did you all sit and watch these? Was there a list of films? How did you approach that?
Well, maybe, I don't know who should answer this, but I don't want to answer for Johan Renck, the director, but he's not a cineast in that sense. He's seen a lot of movies, but when he talks to all of us in pre-production and during the shoot, he's not referring to movies as such. and he was more referring to art, to paintings, to Flemish paintings, to Hieronymus Bosch, and so there was very little talk about films really, and it was more talk about literature, and maybe the biggest reference for the film or the biggest for the show, the biggest reference that we had was the book by Alexievich, the Prayers for Chernobyl, which is the account of what happened, and that became the, I guess, biggest kind of reference for us. And then of course we talked about these films, Tarkovsky, and there was a moment where we wanted to almost not recreate, but where we were very inspired by Andrei Rublev, which is his black and white film shot on anamorphic. So we were discussing that a bit, if we want to recreate the Soviet of that time in terms of visuals, of heavy cameras and anamorphic, but we strayed away from that. And I remember it was good that you mentioned Come and See. That film became something that I guess he showed to the producers, to HBO, to understand what
where he was going, perhaps.
Where he was going, and that is a lot about portraits. It's a lot about people, and Come and See is a lot about the impact of war on people, and which is portrayed with this close-up. So it was more he was more communicating his idea to producers, I guess, or to HBO about these references. But it was very little talk about cinema. It was more talk about, like I said, about what we were doing, the event.
Yeah, there are some very strong. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, and he did say that because he hadn't been to film school, he's never analysed films, and therefore he works with emotion.
Yeah.
Music.
I mean, there's some very strong images when you watch it. There's some quite strong graphic images too. There's a shot, of a water vehicle, a fire engine with the sort of jet sprays. It's a very clean kind of shot. It's almost like a still. And then there's a shot of a man. I think it's on the poster, and he's just spraying. And then there's a drone shot of 3 vehicles traveling in a field, going along. Those things kind of stand out. They feel quite modern, but at the same time, they've got this sort of art, this look of an artistic input is very evident in the film.
Yeah, well, we did have 2 very important pieces from people who were there at the time. One of them is the unsung hero Vladimir Shevchenko, who he was a director and cameraman. He went a few hours to the zone. He worked for TV, Central TV Ukraine, and he created a film called Chernobyl Chronicle of Difficult Weeks. And that had a lot of reference. He did the helicopter crash. He shot the actual helicopter crash above the core when it crashes and falls. He did interviews with the Legasov and the biobots. So we had a lot of actual documented information. And then the other guy was Igor Kostin. He was, in fact, the first guy, he died a year after being at Chernobyl. And Igor Kostin, he worked as a war reporter for the press agency, and a friend of him, his helicopter pilot, who's a friend of his, said there was a fire going on at Chernobyl. So he went down there, he took photographs, and his camera broke down for about 20 shots. And his photographs.
Are we seeing some of these here? What are these that we're seeing?
I mean, this is what Karen's talking about, really. A lot of the kind of early reference was a mixture of sort of almost documentary photography from Igor Kostin, which was sort of seeing in these, and other photographers that invoked a kind of tone that we were after. So I mean, this is a sample really of some of the boards we put together, and a lot of those.
Some of the ridiculous things that they tried to do as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, just trying to scavenge what lead they could to put on the vehicles to protect themselves. A lot of Odil's reference came from these. I mean, she was very hot on wanting to get things authentic. I think we were definitely more keen to strike a kind of coherent tone across the whole thing, and then obviously get the things right that we needed to get right, but we were very aware we were trying to hit dramatic moments as well. So it was about really stark, very raw images that we don't often always get to enjoy, I suppose. This kind of very ugly, beautiful aesthetic, which is just quite.
And Claire, on that note of all this reference, obviously it's a lot of there's a lot of dressing and stuff, and you know, the whole Russian side of it. And I just wondered, you know, the show is called Chernobyl, so I just wondered, did you actually manage to get to Chernobyl?
Yeah, we didn't go to Chernobyl. We did, the second unit went to Chernobyl and did some shots there, but we never got there. But what I was going to say, in terms of the detail and getting things right, which obviously is really important, the one thing about Russia at that time in the 80s is it almost feels like it's 20 years earlier. I mean, when we went to Ukraine, we went into people's houses just for research. We looked in all different types of places, apartments and whatever. And some of those houses looked like they'd come out of the 50s and 60s and 70s. In a way, it was kind of nice that it gave a broad sort of spectrum of what you could put in it. But then on the other hand, you know, you're trying to represent the 80s. But getting hold of items and props and making sure everything was authentic is paramount. But as Luke was saying before, you know, we are creating a drama. It's not a documentary, and all of us wanted to get it so right. We definitely didn't want to get it wrong. But you
no,
also,
I mean, you know, it is
shape.
Yeah, I mean, it's always difficult when you go to countries like that and you have to go and scavenge. You know, but it always sometimes does present its own set of difficulties. And I think often, you know, we all know that working abroad brings with it lots of excitement. It can be very exciting. It can also be a little bit depressing. It's great seeing a whole new world. And I think that, you know, you with your job that you do, Claire, you know, would have involved traveling perhaps between countries. And I know that, you know, because obviously there's no Farley's Props House or eccentric trading or trading post that just happens to be in Lithuania open for your availability. And I know that you were telling me, we had a chat and you were telling me about an incident that happened for you when you got to an airport.
Yeah, I mean, so the one thing about Kiev, which was amazing, no prop houses, but there was a market that went on for miles, which was incredible, which was actually on the train tracks, and it went all the way down the train tracks. And it was honestly just, it had everything from Nazi uniforms to literally everything you could think of is in this market. It's absolutely the most amazing resource ever. For any period dramas ever, I would want to go back to that market. And while I was in the market, I actually managed to pick up dosimeters, actually everything authentic, which I might...
You just need to explain to people that are watching what a dosimeter is, because they won't know.
So it measures radiation. And the thing about it is just to say that some of the items that we picked up and we bought back like that, actually, we did have to get checked for radiation, because we bought things on the internet and we bought, you know, various things, especially in the market, all the stuff I picked up there. I came back with suitcases of things. But
and then when you were in the airport.
Yeah, so one of the things I picked up was a diver's pack, and it's authentic. It was a Russian diver's pack, which one of the divers are wearing. We actually had them made, but the one I bought is real. That's it on the left. I don't know what I was thinking now when I look at it, because I think, oh, but I brought that through with the rest of the props. And as you go into Kiev airport, you have to get everything checked, and they opened up my bag and they pulled it out, they looked at it, we talked about it, and the security were quite happy for me to take it through, so it got put away. Then about 2 hours later, I was getting on the plane and they called my name. So I went to the desk, and a rather tall, stern-looking gentleman said I had to follow him, which I did. Fortunately, I had our action prop master with us, but she wasn't allowed to come with me. She was left behind. And I went in a room with him, and he said, you've got to give your passport. He didn't speak a lot of English. I wasn't that keen to give my passport. Anyway, after a while, I gave my passport. He went, you go there. And ahead of me in the antechamber was a lift with 3 men in it, and one of them had blue gloves on. And he went, you go in there.
And a pot of Vaseline.
I wasn't that keen. I kind of kept saying, I'm not going in there, I'm not going in there. But in the end, there was no way.
Just get that, Lindsay, that joke. If you've woken up now.
Going back to the market.
There was no Vaseline. It was just gloves that were making me terrified.
Yeah, Claire, that's the story you tell. Yeah, carry on.
Anyway, I figured I've got no choice. I got in the lift. It was me and 3 very large, stern-looking men. No one spoke. And the lift was on 0, and then it went down. The number didn't move, but it went on for, I don't know, it felt like floor after floor. We were still on 0. And then we came out into, which essentially was like a derelict building, dingy, hardly any lights. And I didn't think I'd be back, to be honest. I thought that'd be the last story. But I followed this guy. It was so the 4 of us walked down this corridor in the dark, and there was a room at the end with a light on, where there were 5 men. It's just me. I'm quite little. 5 men standing around a table, and I could just see through one guy's arm on the middle of the table was that pack, the divers pack. So I knew that one. I mean, I didn't know what they wanted to say to me. I walked in.
They obviously let you go.
Well, the thing is, what they did is they after a big hoo-ha, no one really spoke English, and they kept questioning me. They put a big ledger down, and it was like something from Harry Potter, the most beautiful prop you've ever seen. They opened it up. It had tons of writing in it, and they threw a pen at me and said, "Sign." They don't normally sign things I've not read. I figured it was a good idea. So I've signed my life away in Ukraine. I signed it, and then they took me out, and they let me get on the plane. They held the plane, and I came back to Lithuania.
And here you are.
And here I am. I survived.
You see, Jakob and Lindsay, you just don't get it. What goes on in the arts department, what we sacrifice to bring things to you.
I've heard that story before. I didn't know about that.
You just don't know.
Creative with trying to get quite a
sheltered existence.
We didn't want to be 1980s. It needed to be Soviet Union, and
yeah,
it was a lot of sourcing out there, a lot of making. And yeah, how many times did you go to that market, Claire?
I went to the market 3 times. It was the most amazing market, and you actually, at one point, the trains actually run through it, and then people have to move all their stuff. It's unbelievable, and the trains come through quite slow. And the first time I went, I got trapped, and I couldn't see the people that I was with, our crew from Ukraine. And I waited and waited, and in the end, everyone was climbing over the moving train. So I climbed over the moving train. It's what Karen was saying before about working in different countries. You kind of have to embrace who you are.
Yeah, well, it's when you travel, it's like I said before, that can be the fun part, or it can be the scary part, or it can be the sad part. It was
quite freeing, though. I mean, there was locations we went in and we didn't shoot in them, but we liked the lights, for example, in the ceiling, so we just took them. It's things like that, and they ended up in the Kremlin conference room. I didn't know what I wanted them for, but at the time, there was a freedom to it as well, that you could be quite bold.
Yeah, I think they do. There's a fair bit of that goes on, and then it ends up in that market.
Oh no, they had to be returned.
Go at night, and
they had to be returned.
Night out. That a night out in Lithuania, go and take some lights down and flog them in the market to unassuming English birds that come. No,
no. They had to go back. There was an awful lot of bureaucracy and red tape. Whatever we touched, whatever we moved, everything had to have about 20 pieces of paper. We had to stamp, we had to write, we had to sign, we had to photograph. I mean, it was incredible, the amount of red tape we had to go through.
Moving equipment between the countries must have been a logistical nightmare. I can't imagine.
Absolutely.
Did you? I mean, I know you would have, Karen, and you would have experienced that in the arts department. Did you, Jakob, how did that work for you? You obviously taking equipment, toing and froing. What was the search like? Was it, how did that work? Did you match things? What did you do?
Our camera equipment, for example, came from Berlin. So we had to go to Berlin, and so all our camera tests and different trials that we did was in Berlin. But once again, to be able to go away with your crew to Berlin is also part of getting to know each other. And when you come to a new rental house, they're also very excited to have you there, and you're entering. Even that becomes a little culture, a little world in itself, to be away from Lithuania in Berlin. So all these kind of glitches, or these things that might not seem kind of so practical, or make the logistics more difficult, I think something always comes out of it, you know. And if I hadn't gone to Berlin, maybe I wouldn't have found the lenses that we end up shooting with. I had planned to shoot with this very, quite normal lenses, but then in Berlin, I discovered these lenses that I had no idea I would use, So all traveling is good. I hope we can all travel after all this.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about the lenses and the camera that you chose to shoot on. So I just wondered, as we've got you on this call, it might be interesting for people to know about how you came to those decisions to use the equipment that you did.
Yeah, at first, or earlier I mentioned Andrei Rublev, and we thought for a while that we wanted to enter visually the world of the Soviet world, or of the Soviet Union. And doing that, we thought we would use even old Russian anamorphic lenses. To create a feeling of machinery, of heavy equipment, of steel, and lots of layer of glass. So almost like a character actor, we thought that the camera should also become Soviet somehow. And we thought of using a mechanical shutter instead of a digital shutter. We thought of using a digital camera with a mechanical shutter, which would also, in a subtle way, but still it would give us a feeling of more of a strobe to the look, or of a shutter, or like a film camera. So we had all these ideas, and we thought of using big cranes and not too much handheld. But then we had a lot of time to talk about this. For 4 months, we were discussing this, and after a while, you're almost getting bored of your ideas, or you start to question them. And then we almost did a U-turn, and we thought, let's forget all this. Let's just be as honest as possible, and let's not interfere with the story. Let's just be there with the characters. So let's shoot with these very normal lenses. We thought of shooting these ultra primes, which are quite boring lenses, but they don't interfere with anything. They just tell the story. They don't have any artifacts. So that was the idea. But when I came to Berlin, they kind of gave me these lenses, which are vintage lenses. And I thought, I don't want to use any vintage lenses. That's wrong. I don't want to put any look onto this. I don't want to interfere or any, like I said, we don't want any artifacts. But then when we shot the test with this, they felt right suddenly.
You loved them, didn't you?
I mean, they had a soul to them that we liked, and it was interesting. We did like 8 different lens tests, and it was like a blind test. And for me, it was test number 5 which was correct, and I showed it to Johan, the director, and it was also a blind test. And he said, "Oh, 5 looks great." And it was, we were shot in Berlin with an ARRI engineer sitting with his blue ARRI t-shirt, with the window behind him, so it was not kind of a Chernobyl setup, but still it gave us the soul that we were looking for. So that was interesting.
That was definitely worth making that decision. And Lindsay, because obviously lighting affects you a lot with what you do. And I was interested to hear a little bit about you. I mean, obviously, you all talk to each other all the time. We all talk to all the other departments. But the establishing shot of the show, I just wanted to know, how much of that was a visual effect, and did you use many drones? Did you do any LiDAR scanning of any buildings at all? To help you out. How did you approach doing it?
We did a lot of LiDAR scanning. I mean, the big question, sort of, in terms of environments, was obviously the plant itself, which ended up being a bit of a sort of jigsaw pieces, but I think worked absolutely brilliantly ultimately. So we had Luke's set for the reactor, which in terms of the scale of the plant is actually quite small for where the firefighters arrive. Then we had Ignalina, which is our stand-in for Chernobyl, which is a very similar plant to Chernobyl, but is not exactly the same. The reactors that are there are quite different. Fortunately, Ignalina has a space where Chernobyl reactors 3 and 4 would be if you were turning Ignalina into Chernobyl. So we ended up scanning Ignalina for about a week. A couple of guys lived there. I mean, just getting permission to scan at Ignalina at a sort of a nuclear power plant that's in the state of being decommissioned was very tricky, and for a long time was a bit of an unknown. So we had obviously scanned Luke's set piece, scanned Ignalina, but then we also managed to inherit a 3D model of the Chernobyl nuclear plant itself from a Russian post house that had used it on a previous TV show. We had to do a fair bit of work to it, but it was a brilliant sort of head start to us. So we could take Chernobyl reactors 3 and 4, put it into the scan we had of Ignalina, combine it with Luke's set, and yeah, I mean, it worked brilliant. I do think the whole firefighters arriving, when you know actually how it was pieced together in terms of the small sets, seeing that the fire engines arrive at Ignalina, I do think it all worked brilliantly well ultimately. But
quite good when you get some money to spend, isn't it?
Between everyone here to make that work.
Yeah. So obviously, Karen, this all of putting all this together, and Claire and Luke, I just wanted to talk a little bit while we're talking about the visual effects. There's always this when it's happening, you're building the set, and you obviously get your restraints are the budget, and you build as much as you can. On this, you have some huge scale things that you had to do. So obviously having visual effects to back you up must have been really helpful. But obviously there are some places where you can't do that. Like, I mean, I don't know, I know with the Liquidators camp, I think you had to make quite a lot of that, didn't you? Or did you, how much of that, for example, was real and how much of that was a visual effect?
Yeah, the good thing about this is we all started quite early. So this sort of relationship between what we were trying to do in the art department and what Lindsay was doing in his department, that conversation started so early that actually we reached a conclusion quite early on that building more was going to be better than doing more in post, largely because the story is about people and you want to follow them and be with them and you don't want to have to cut around them. All of this. We built bigger sets purely because partly because the script demanded it, but because it gave more scope to the production. And just purely serendipitously, I think, the studio, which wasn't really a studio, it was a shell of a building, really, that was out in Lithuania. I can quickly bring that up, actually, but was just quite a good shape to begin with. And so we had 6 weeks in London. With Lindsay before we kind of went out to Lithuania, which the last main focus of that was, we knew we wanted to use Ignalina somehow. We knew we obviously had to replicate Chernobyl because there were certain elements of it that were iconic, like the tower. And then we settled on this stage and the land around it. So we kind of modeled it all and put it all together like a puzzle and find these splice points. And then from that, you kind of work out what we should build and where. We had to create this backlot that you're seeing now. And you can see the sort of stage is really just a shell of a building. But it was a good opportunity because it allowed us to build sets that went from exterior into interior and gave us the possibility to kind of really run a whole scene as one. I mean, it's not, not what we did all the time, but it gave a lot more fluidity. And I think Johan specifically, I don't know, Jakob, would you agree? Like on the day, he reacts to things on the day very much, and that's where he's quite sort of unique and interesting to work with. So to give him more, I think really helped. Anyway, yes.
I mean, obviously, it's great when you're somewhere like, where you chose to film, there's always this sort of huge amounts of vast spaces that you get. It's very difficult here in England to find sort of factories that are disused because the land space is so valuable. So I think sometimes that's why we make these decisions to go to these countries, because that makes it so much more interesting. And Karen, I just, it's not just about the set build or the props. There's a huge amount of action vehicles that need to be got in for something like this. You're dealing with Russian vehicles, and I know you're very experienced at dealing with picture vehicles, and you've worked on some very big shows where you've had to do a lot of involvement. So, can you talk about can you talk about any of the problems that you maybe had to solve, or finding them, or was the action, do you use an action vehicle coordinator? Did you find you had to call someone in England to come and help you out, or how did it work?
No, I actually decided to use local people, but the guy we used was the guy who just come from special effects. We sort of tended to find people worked in lots of different departments, never specialized in anything. But he was one of his jobs actually was to, no, maybe I shouldn't say that. Anyway, he was very determined and he was very proud of being able to. He was very, very keen, but he loved and adored Russian vehicles, Soviet vehicles. He really did, and he had such a passion. Passion's the word I'm looking for. He was so passionate, but he found it very difficult to get other people to help him because the way his mindset was very different to a lot of other people's mindsets coming from that particular country. So he got very, very frustrated with the bureaucracy and the red tape. I mean, I went with him right at the beginning to this metal merchant. That was very, very interesting, the kind of pieces of metal we found there. It was like -12. We couldn't actually, the metal merchant had 4 old fire engines, which were perfect, the Soviet ones. Again, no, people don't hold on to these kind of vehicles because nobody wants them. Nobody wants to be reminded. No. A lot of them were frozen. The doors were frozen solid because it was so cold. We had to get into some of them because we wanted to purchase them. That was an extraordinary experience. Again, a whole bunch of guys with serious dogs, and me and the action vehicle guy, him not speaking English very well, and I speak small words in Russian, and he can do a little bit of Russian and small bits of Lithuanian, and these guys. I mean, some of them. There was a museum that had one, I think. The fire brigades are still using some of these in Lithuania. We tried to get those, but again, we weren't allowed to because the fire brigades belong to the state and they didn't want to have anything to do with us. Even though we wrote letters to them to ask them to help us out, especially with the ladder one, they wait for 20 days until they have to respond to a ladder because that's what the state says. So the ones from the metal merchant all had to be completely gutted, pretty much repainted.
You brought up the painting. I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about that because Jakob, you'd mentioned, I think you said, we're not shooting, I don't know who it was, said we're not shooting a documentary. So I just wondered, about altering colors on vehicles to suit the style that you were going for. Did you do that?
No, I think asking who you're asking.
Yes, either, yeah.
Well, we looked at pretty much well. We kept the Soviet colors.
The problem wasn't it, that they all came different colors slightly.
Well, those all came
red, and we wanted the fire engines obviously to feel homogeneous, so we painted them one shade of red. That was certain things like that. You don't want to deviate from authenticity. It's like the ambulance that we had to have pretty much made from scratch in Kiev. There's a sort of fleet of 6 of them because they just you can't get hold of them. But they were very important.
There were 2 vehicles we couldn't get, very important vehicles we couldn't get from Lithuania. They were the buses because obviously they're big pieces of metal and again they rust. They still use those buses in the Ukraine, but they need to be painted and they had to come over the border again with all the papers, with all the low loaders, with all the men, with all the red tape, and then we had to paint them when they got over to the Lithuanian border, and then the correct colors, and then we had to paint them before they went back over the border again, so the papers were all correct. And the ambulances, like Luke said, that we couldn't get any ambulances in because they were quite thin, tinny vehicles that went through a lot, and so these kind of vehicles haven't survived in Lithuania.
And Jakob, a red is quite a tricky color. I always find because sometimes it just is so glaringly obvious, and it's not my favorite. I'll be honest. I do have a thing about not too much pillar box red. It was very desaturated, the show. It had a look, there was a griminess to it that it had. So, when you were shooting like reams of that red, I mean, were you dealing with the grading as you were going? Is that how you tackled it?
Well, we had a test shoot. We had a test shoot with actors doing different things in different costumes, and then of course. We had also makeup test and wardrobe test. So in that, we kind of tried out the different LUTs, so to speak, that we had on the camera, and to see how they, worked, of course, with the costumes. But as for the red ambulance, I can't remember. But I think if we dealt with it on set, how we looked like. But we were quite stoic or quite strong. Had a strong opinion about the LUT that we had on the camera, that we had kind of created during pre-production. That was something that we just went for, and luckily it kind of worked even with the red fire trucks and stuff. But I don't know. I mean, it might have, of course, the desaturation that we had on the camera, it affected what we had done in wardrobe and in production design. But I think we all felt that it might interfere with the colors, but it just feels correct. It feels right to us.
Yes. Yeah.
So what we saw in the rush is that so then you buy it, then you're okay with any artifacts that you're getting, as long as you get transported to this world that we are kind of creating.
Yes. Yes.
So technically it might have been wrong. It might not have been a right red color in the end that we're showing, but at least we like we said, like Kate said, we sourced the right color, but then it might have been slightly changed in post.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of use of color in the show, which also, there's the radioactivity. I think that's quite a big thing to bring up about how you tackled doing that, because I'm guessing that you did a sort of live portion of that. And then I don't know, Lindsay, did you enhance that, or, did you get loads of sample lights in? How did you tackle that?
Well, I mentioned my Spark earlier, who was 6 years old. He told me about what happened after the accident, that he hadn't been allowed to. He had told his children that they were not allowed to go out, of course, but then especially they were not allowed to go out in sunlight. And I never heard that before. Even in Sweden, we were not allowed to go out. I never heard that they were scared of the sunlight. But apparently they felt that they saw the particles, or they saw the radioactivity in the particles, or in the rays of sun, when the dust was backlit. So the sun was something scary for them somehow. And then we were on this on the scout trip in Kiev, where we saw this enormous mural, which I think Luke has a picture of. It's a mural showing the atom, it's almost a religious painting. It almost looks like it's a new god that they are looking at, this one, and it's the atom, and it's kind of portrayed here as the sun. Mm-hmm. And you see the rays from this atom. So this kind of gave us the idea to let's try to symbolize, or let's try to show the radioactivity as sun.
Yes.
So the sun rays became the kind of the something foreboding, something that that you should be afraid of. And this was put through the entire show. Of course, it's done in a subtle way, but in general, the more sick someone got, the more kind of overexposed the person gets.
Yeah.
So that's how we worked with the sun.
It worked. It certainly worked very well. I mean, you all must have been so thrilled with the end result. I know, I'm sure when you read the script, Luke, you must have thought, wow, this is really great bit of storytelling, very well written, the whole piece. I don't know, I mean, when you got the call, Luke, what was your first reaction to it? You must have been quite excited about the fact that you were going to tackle something that was a world phenomena that had happened.
No, I mean, the script was amazing. At the time, all I had was the pilot. So even that drew you in. I think the thing with this project, there was so many layers to it. The fact that it was based on a true story, the fact that it was still relevant in so many ways to now, and do we trust the people in power? And then the fact that it was really about people and various individual acts of heroism within it. It wasn't necessarily just focused. It wasn't a disaster movie. And then when we got more episodes, what I found really interesting, and it was important to try and take through, and I think this is something we did discuss with Johan and Craig quite a bit, was that it's like the genre of the show changes through the episode. So you almost start with like a war movie, and then it becomes like almost science fiction and horror, and then ends in this trial and this drama. And it was just so interesting to, again, it's sort of monitoring that overall coherence and then finding those contrasts within. So the script on this was definitely one of the biggest draws, but the appendage at the end of the script that Craig had put together was this huge kind of research Bible that he'd used to write with, which had links. And I think Jakob mentioned the Svetlana book, which was tonally just a really good book to the person, because it was individuals' stories interviewed by this journalist of the time. It gives real insight actually into how they lived then, which was then compounded by the fact that we ended up filming in that part of the world, and we were working, and our crew were so passionately remembering these times as well.
Had any of you worked with each other before this job?
Yeah, well, I worked with Karen and yourself, but you weren't on. I mean, on this call. I mean,
no, but I mean, in a sort of, yes, you had. Obviously with me, you know, and you'd worked and you knew Karen from before, but, you know, it's an interesting thing, you know, you've all done, it's done terribly well, the show. And so it was obviously well, you know, you made the right decisions about the crew that you brought together on this. And, you know, and it's an award-winning crew. I can say that because you've all won prizes. And, you know, so, I mean, for you, Luke, you know, obviously having Karen and Claire, it must have been quite an advantage, you know, that you probably thought, actually, I've cracked it. I made the right decision. You know, and I know it's important when you go away that you always take the right people with you. You know, you need to take those key people with you. I'm sure, Lindsay, you know, maybe you were allowed to take some people with you, and Jakob, you know, your gaffer or operator or whatever. You know, and it is a very important thing, isn't it? That sort of solidarity that you have with each other and that relationship, and the piece, you know, comes together so beautifully. And, you know, that's why Chernobyl, I think, is so successful, because you all seem to get on and have pulled it off very well. I'd like to talk about the music. I know that you probably met the composer while you were filming, but she did the most amazing job. And then she went on and did the Joker. And I don't know, you know, when you all saw it, you know, Karen, when you saw it the first time you watched episode 1, was the music, were you really pleased with the way that the music kind of because it does put it all together?
Yeah, I mean, the music's very atmospheric, and because Johan used to play a lot of music during the whole of the shooting, quite loudly sometimes. So we all had a bit of an idea about where his head was regarding music. So I think we all felt that he would do something very atmospheric.
Yes.
Indeed. I mean, I've worked with some other directors who have, you know, used very abstract music, and I felt that Johan was one of those kind of people.
You didn't have to listen to endless Russian marching songs every day. Would have made you go slightly funny.
No, we listened to Sinead O'Connor's first album a lot. To be honest. It's actually quite, you know, there's a lot of mood going on.
Well, I think the thing is, you know, you are working on a show where it's pretty grim. I mean, let's be honest. It's not, you know, you're not working on sort of like the Durrells, are you? Where you can go off for a quick swim at lunchtime in a nice ocean.
No, but in the studio had paper thin walls, and Johan played his music really loud. I mean, he was in past another corridor, and yet we could still hear his music. It's like, get him out of here, because we can't concentrate.
Yeah. I mean, there are. I have a couple of questions I'd just like to ask you, which from someone that wrote in. His name is James, and James O'Shea is a storyboard artist, and he sent some great questions in. I think I sent them to some of you to see beforehand. This is for you, Luke. He's asking, did you create any artwork or mood boards for a pitch or treatment?
Yes, the very short answer. The long answer, I mean, for every job I think you do, but when it pitched, it just generally it started with lots of tonal boards, which were mixed with kind of real reference for, I think I showed some earlier, real reference from historical reference, sorry, and then tonally where I felt the project should be. So we sort of started there, and it got excited from that point, and then it's constantly throughout. Yeah, I mean, there were some photographers that like I focused in on, like Gerd Ludwig and Alexander Gronsky, who just had the right sort of there's a lot to do with light. I mean, we talked endlessly with Jakob about use of fluorescent light and things like that to get more of a jarring, sickening overtone to this show that kind of just to avoid this sort of Western cliche and this Russian nostalgia that you see a lot in like some other movies and representations of the Soviet Union. So and that compounded with Johan has a sort of darkness to him anyway, so I think we've got on very well in that respect.
I mean, just to say about the lights, I'm just going to say at the beginning when Jakob was talking before about doing tests, I don't know if you remember, Jakob, that we had 7 pasting tables of lamps to test with at the very beginning. We'd gone out and just got all these lamps because we were looking at how the light kind of refracts through, you know, just to do interesting things. So we just went out and just found.
And you got the camera department to pay for those, didn't you, Claire? You snuck that in on their budget, didn't you, Claire?
Oh, yeah. If only that were true.
Oh, if only. Yes.
We were
That
always
little line at the bottom of the budget that says "does not include," and in big writing, anything the camera department wants.
Camera department requests. No, but I mean, you know, in a way, it was.
That's a joke, Jakob. It's a joke.
Always willing, Jakob, you know.
Karen, James has written another question here, which I'm going to ask you, which is the sets and the locations enhance the narrative hugely, depicting the heroes operating in a larger machinery. Did you feel that the design was done that way, you know, when you tackled it and you were talking to Luke and drawing things up with the art directors, did you feel they felt like stones and they were like, he says they were like within a wheel of Soviet power? Do you think that you kind of went that far, that you were thinking like that? I mean, you showed that imagery of that mural before, Jakob, and talked about that because you were explaining about how you wanted to create this feeling of light. So do you think that's something that comes across in the show, Karen? Or, you know, was it purposeful, or do you think that it could be read, you could read that into it?
What, you mean the...
Was it like that for you, Lindsay, in your palace that they put you in? Did you have to walk around in your hats and gloves, or were you in a nice 5-star hotel, darling?
And we were pretty well looked after, to be fair, but
I mean, obviously Jakob was in his penthouse and he wouldn't care with his jacuzzi, so he was fine.
I mean, all the recce's we did, they were all everything was buried under snow, wasn't it? So some of them were actually quite difficult to actually achieve what you were there to achieve and judge stuff, because it was, you know, literally, well, I think it was like -20, -25, and everything was under snow.
I know what it's like working. I did a job in Prague, and it was -20 most of the time. And your mobile phone doesn't work. If people think their mobile phones are going to work, they're mistaken. So you have to kind of shove it down inside you, and you have to sort of talk like that, but you can't really see what you're doing. Can't leave your laptop in your car because it'll just be like a brick. And the interesting thing is, if there's no lavatory facilities, which often happens when you're in tricky countries and there's a problem, so you do have to go outside. So it's quite interesting when you're a female and you have to go outside to the bathroom, because unfortunately you don't have that little trap door at the front that you can use conveniently, do you? So, you know, all those things, people go, oh, it must be so interesting and great. And you're like, well.
No. And also in the evening, when you get your car, you're scraping the ice from inside the car, off the windscreen. And you're sitting there in the car park, all on your toes, waiting for your car to warm up, as the snow carries on falling, and trying to drive away.
But it is quite interesting, because you do get, you know, I'm sure, like I've had endless comments about the breath. You know, you do get that, the real breath, don't you? Instead of, you know, you having to put that in, Lindsay, which is often looks weird.
Well,
you know, and
sort of conversely, so we had all the sort of recce's in snow, and then cut to the summer in Kiev, and we were doing the scene with Ludmilla, heavily pregnant, sat on the bench, high summer, and it was supposed to be a snowy, wintry scene, and poor Jessie was just sweltering in a big fur. We had some practical snow, but I remember we had to keep it quite quickly. We're moving these blue screens around, and every time we moved it around, they get covered in more snow. So the blue was slowly going white, and I mean, we made it work in the end. But
yeah, it's very funny. People who don't work in the, you know, in the arts department or in the film industry, sometimes they, you know, you can go somewhere, they don't realize that you shot an entire snow sequence in the middle of summer, you know, and you're going and trying to pick leaves off of trees, you know, or you say the visual effects supervisor come and say, can you do something about those trees? Well, they're oak trees. They've been in Windsor Park for an awful long time. I'm not sure we can cut them down. Yeah. And I do get asked that, Lindsay, by the way.
It's always that, or it's adding green leaves to wintry trees.
Or or the other way around. So I think, you know, there are those things that happen that, you know, we deal with, and we just go, why are we doing this? It's ridiculous. I know, Luke, I think Claire told me a story about how living props had to come out, and they laid meters and meters. Is this right, Karen? I heard meters and meters of lawn for one of the sets that you had. And I wonder,
it was trying
how
to.
does that work? Do they pack that up in their suitcases and bring that out, or?
No, they sourced the lawn locally.
I know how they do it, but I just thought you might like to tell the audience watching.
Yeah, we had this great idea. Pripyat was quite hard to do because obviously it's all the images out there, the famous kind of 20 years later total decay. And we wanted to show this kind of reward town that was Pripyat. So we kind of combined lots of towns. Our location manager, Jonas, was amazing. He managed to get everybody on side, and we turned all of their car parks into parks. And for that, we needed to lay hundreds of meters of lawn. So the lawn was sourced locally, painstakingly, and then yes, we needed an army of people to come and help lay it. So it was a mixture of our sort of prop team in Lithuania and living kind of orchestrating that, wasn't it, Karen?
I'm just going to say great thanks to the fire department though, because the
oh my God, they watered it all, yeah.
After being -24, it suddenly 30 degrees.
Summer in Lithuania.
We tried to get special effects to do it, but they were so busy that we couldn't. Yeah, the lovely fire department came out.
They did.
Yes. Well, it must have been an interesting experience for you all. We're going to wrap this up now this evening because we've done our allotted time that we do, and it's been really interesting. And I'm sure the people watching it, who are watching it live on Zoom, have enjoyed it. And it will be watched on YouTube live too. But then people often, they go back and they watch these. And they're very important to do because, you know, not everybody, you know, particularly the people who've just joined the British Film Designers Guild and people who've just joined into the art departments, they find it quite interesting to hear from people like yourselves of the pitfalls and the joy and the excitement. And I think certainly this was a great one to pick because Chernobyl has been, you know, it's a very successful show. And well done, Jane Featherstone, if you're watching. You made the right decision to get it done. That was terrific. And I'm sure you're very pleased. I think you have 14 nominations with the BAFTAs, I believe that you have. Which is incredibly well done. And I do wish you, all of you that I can see on the screen, I do wish you all the best of luck with the BAFTAs. I believe they're in July. And I think you're going to do it like this when you do your acceptance speech. So you can wear whatever you like from here down. No one will know, Lindsay, if you're in your gym jams. Yeah, or wearing your tutu. Yeah, so I'd like to thank you all. I'd like to thank Claire, Karen, Luke, Lindsay, Jakob. Thank you so much for joining this evening. And I'm going to say it's goodbye from me. And we're going to say goodbye to everybody now that's watching. And that is the end of that. And thank you for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks,
guys.